When a white police officer decides to arrest a black man without reason, he doesn't realize he is making the biggest mistake of his career because that man is a federal prosecutor. A story of injustice, twists, and justice that you need to see until the end. Jack O'Connor was a man whose reputation preceded him in Richmond, Virginia. At 35, he had built his career in the police force with a mix of dedication to his work and behavior often criticized by his more sensible colleagues. Jack was the type of officer who patrolled not only with a badge, but also with a preconceived notion of who should or shouldn't be in certain places. His prejudices were no secret. Comments made during meetings and attitudes in day-to-day life made it clear that he believed a person's skin color was, in itself, sufficient reason for suspicion. That night, however, would be marked by one of his most unfounded and revealing encounters. It was a calm night in Richmond, the kind of night that made the city seem safe and peaceful. The streets were relatively empty, with only a few people coming in and out of cafes and small bars. Jack drove his patrol car with an almost theatrical vigilance, as if he expected something big to happen at any moment. He enjoyed patrolling the upper-middle-class neighborhoods, places where he believed certain types of people shouldn't be. And it was right there in front of a well-lit cafe with few occupied tables that Jack spotted what he considered an anomaly. A black man sitting behind the wheel of a high-end sports car, parked quietly. Jack slowed down his patrol car and observed the vehicle for a few seconds. It was a luxury model with flawless paint and wheels that looked like they had come straight out of a high-end car magazine. The man inside the car, Darren Johnson, appeared to be distracted, looking at his phone and sipping coffee. For Jack, the mere fact that a black man was driving a car of that caliber in a neighborhood like that was enough to raise suspicions. He parked the patrol car and got out ostentatiously, adjusting his belt and placing his hand on the flashlight attached to his holster. He walked up to Darren's car with firm steps and opened the encounter with a harsh tone. "Good evening. What are you doing parked here?" Darren, without taking his eyes off the officer, calmly replied, "I'm waiting for a friend who works nearby. Is something wrong?" Jack didn't like direct answers, especially from someone who, in his distorted view, should show submission. He leaned slightly toward the car window, illuminating the interior with his flashlight, and insisted, "You're acting suspiciously. Can you step out of the vehicle?" Darren took a deep breath and replied, maintaining his calm, "Suspicious of what, exactly? I'm parked in a permitted spot. I'm not breaking any laws." The response seemed to ignite something within Jack, as if his authority was being questioned. "I'm not going to repeat myself," Jack said, now with a firmer voice. Darren, realizing that the confrontation could escalate quickly, decided to comply to avoid bigger problems. He got out of the car with his hands visible, while Jack began an ostentatious search, shining the flashlight into every corner of the vehicle and checking the glove compartment, even without permission to do so. Darren, with his patience wearing thin, questioned, "I have the right to know the reason for this stop. You have nothing against me." Jack ignored the comment and began to search Darren, running his hands over his body in a rough and unnecessarily invasive manner. He found nothing, neither in the car nor on Darren. Still, he seemed determined to make something happen. "Show me your ID," Jack ordered. Darren handed over the document without hesitation, but when he tried to question the legitimacy of the stop again, Jack interrupted, saying, "You're resisting authority. Handcuff him right now." Without warning, Jack pulled the handcuffs from his belt and, despite Darren not showing any resistance, put them on with excessive force. "This is abuse," Darren said, trying to maintain his composure, but his voice carried a tone of frustration that was impossible to hide. Jack, however, seemed immune to logic or reason at that moment. "You can explain that at the station," he replied, pushing Darren toward the patrol car. The cafe, which had been quiet until then, began to attract curious glances from a few people who noticed the incident. A man passing by on the sidewalk even questioned Jack about what was happening, but the officer completely ignored him, maintaining his rigid and determined posture. Darren, handcuffed in the back seat of the patrol car, looked out the window with a mix of indignation and resignation, aware that he would not be heard, no matter what he said. Upon arriving at the precinct, Jack O'Connor seemed even more self-assured. He got out of the patrol car with heavy steps, holding Darren Johnson by the arm in an unnecessarily firm grip, even though he was not resisting. Inside the building, The environment was lit by cold lights, and the sound of ringing phones and murmurs from police officers filled the space. Jack led Darren to the booking area, where the lights felt even more oppressive. The clinking of metal handcuffs echoed as he removed them, only to replace them with another pair attached to a metal bench. Jack crossed his arms and began to taunt. "So, Mr. Sporty, what exactly were you doing in that neighborhood? Let me guess, thinking about how to break into some house without getting caught." The tone was laden with disdain, and the smirk on his face made it clear that Jack was not interested in hearing answers. Darren, sitting with his hands now handcuffed in front of him, slowly raised his eyes to the officer, maintaining a calm and steady gaze. "I've asked before, but I'll ask again. Why am I being arrested? What is the actual charge?" Jack laughed exaggeratedly, almost theatrically, and shook his head. "Charge? Do you think someone like you needs a specific charge to get caught? Look, you parked that fancy car in a place where you shouldn't have been. That's all I need to know. You want to know? I bet that car isn't even yours. It must be stolen." The room fell momentarily silent. Darren continued to look at Jack, not averting his gaze, as if patiently waiting for the officer to finish his performance. Meanwhile, other officers in the room began to pay attention. Among them was Sergeant Mike Henderson, a middle-aged man with tired eyes who was well aware of Jack's problematic history. Mike was not a fan of his colleague's behavior, but he also knew that Jack had influential friends in the police command. Confronting him publicly could mean trouble for anyone. Still, Mike couldn't hide his discomfort, exchanging glances with one of the younger officers, who looked equally disturbed by the scene. Jack, sensing he had an audience, continued his show. "You think you're fooling me with that saintly look? I bet you've been in trouble before. What was it again? Resisting authority? Maybe a little drug dealing? Come on, admit it. It'll make your life a lot easier." Darren remained silent, and this seemed to irritate Jack even more, who leaned in closer to him. "What's the matter? You're just going to keep staring at me like that? You think that haughty look is going to intimidate me? Don't forget one thing. In here, I'm the one in charge." Darren sighed, clearly exhausted, but maintained his calm demeanor. "Look, I'm not going to argue with you. It's already clear what's happening here. I just want you to tell me exactly what the charge is. It's my right to know." Jack took a step back, clapping sarcastically. "Right? You want to talk about rights now? Maybe you should have thought about that before acting suspiciously in that neighborhood." Sergeant Henderson, who had been keeping his distance until then, finally approached, albeit hesitantly. "Jack, what's going on here? What's the charge against him?" Jack turned to the sergeant with an impatient expression. "Resisting authority? Obviously. The guy was there, acting like he owned the place, and when I asked him to get out of the car, he started questioning. It looked like he was about to run at any moment." Henderson crossed his arms, clearly skeptical, but said nothing more. The silence in the room felt heavy, and the uncomfortable glances from the other officers were evident. Still, no one had the courage to intervene directly. Darren, realizing he wouldn't have support there, remained silent, but there was something in his gaze that deeply unsettled Jack. It was the serenity, the confidence of someone who knew he had done nothing wrong. That, for Jack, was more unbearable than any scream or attempt at resistance. "You think you're better than everyone here, don't you?" Jack asked, stepping closer to Darren once again, with that look of someone who isn't afraid. "You should be afraid, you know? People like you should understand what your place is." Darren raised an eyebrow and calmly replied, "And what exactly would that place be?" The question, though simple, hit Jack like a blow. He opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, he abruptly turned and went to the booking desk, pretending to be busy filling out paperwork. The tension in the room was palpable. Henderson took a step back, returning to his desk, but kept his eyes on Darren. He knew Jack was wrong, but he also knew that reporting or confronting him directly could mean stepping into dangerous territory. Other officers, who had started to whisper discreetly among themselves, remained divided between indignation and fear of acting. Meanwhile, Darren, despite the humiliating situation, held his head high. He knew that that night was just another example of what so many other black people face daily. He also knew that his calmness was a form of resistance. For Jack, every second of that serene gaze was a reminder that his authority was not absolute, and it consumed him from within. Jack O'Connor took Darren to an interrogation room in the back of the police station. The environment was small and poorly lit, with a scratched metal table and two uncomfortable chairs. The gray walls seemed to absorb any trace of humanity, making the space cold and oppressive. Jack gestured for Darren to sit down, which he did without protest, maintaining the same calm expression he had been displaying since the approach. For Jack, this was unbearable. He expected to find nervousness, fear, or even anger, but all he saw was an unshakable man. "Let's get this over with," Jack began, pulling out a chair and sitting down with a heavy thud. He placed a notepad on the table, although he had no intention of using it, and leaned forward, coming just inches from Darren's face. "You can make things easier for yourself if you start talking now. Who else was with you? What were you planning in that neighborhood? And don't bother lying, because I already know something is wrong with this story." Darren slowly crossed his arms and looked at Jack, speaking with a cutting calmness. "I have nothing to say without a lawyer present." The response was like a spark in a powder keg. Jack slammed his palm on the table hard, making the sound echo through the room. "Oh, so you're one of those. Hiding behind lawyers, is that it? Let me tell you something, Darren. I know a liar when I see one. And you have something to hide. Maybe not today, maybe not now, but sooner or later the truth comes out." Darren did not react to Jack's outburst. He simply adjusted his posture in the chair and looked directly into his eyes, as if the officer were invisible. "I'm not hiding anything. What's happening here is abuse of power, and you know it." Jack laughed, but it was a dry, almost nervous laugh. "Abuse of power? You think this is a courtroom? You were caught in a place you shouldn't have been, acting suspiciously, and now you want to play the victim. That's not going to work with me. If you want to complicate things even more for yourself, fine. I have time." The silence that followed seemed to fill the room. Jack hoped Darren would say something, anything he could use against him, but the man's serenity only irritated him more. He began to pace the room, gesturing and speaking loudly. "That sports car you were driving, huh? You want to convince me that a guy like you got that honestly? Are you going to tell me you're a successful businessman or something? Give me a break. I know exactly how these things work." Darren simply shook his head, not breaking eye contact. "You have absolutely nothing against me. You're trying to intimidate me, but it's not going to work. I want my lawyer." Darren's insistence on staying calm and demanding his rights seemed to eat away at Jack inside. The officer returned to the table, leaning in closer to Darren once again, fists clenched. "Let me tell you something. You might think you're doing well right now, but this smart aleck act of yours isn't going to last long. People like you always end up in the same place. And guess what? I'll be there to make sure of it." Once again, Darren didn't take the bait. He just took a deep breath and replied, "You're saying exactly what I expected. Keep going. Every word you say only proves what's happening here." Jack, now visibly frustrated, abruptly stood up, pushing the chair back with a crash. He walked to the door and opened it forcefully, stopping to look at Darren before leaving. "You know what? I'm going to give you some time to think. When you're ready to tell the truth, let me know." Darren watched Jack leave, and the door closed with a metallic sound. Minutes later, two other officers came and took him to a cell. The space was cramped and cold, with stained walls and a small concrete bench. Darren sat down, still wearing the same calm expression, and stared at the cell door as if nothing could shake his determination. For him, every minute of that situation reinforced the need to maintain his stance and demand justice, even if it was hard-earned. Meanwhile, Jack returned to the reception area of the police station, visibly irritated. He looked at the other officers with an air of superiority and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Just another smart-ass criminal. He thinks he knows everything, but he's going to fall right into place. It's just a matter of time." At the reception of the police station, Jack was bent over a registration form, trying to put together a plausible accusation against Darren. The pen in his hand moved quickly, but the words he was writing made no sense even to him. Jack knew his approach was unfounded, but he also knew that his reputation at the station, although controversial, gave him some freedom to act. He had manipulated similar situations before, but something about that night felt different. Perhaps it was Darren's unwavering demeanor, or maybe it was the attentive gaze of Sergeant Mike Henderson, who was now approaching with firm steps. Henderson stopped next to Jack, crossing his arms. The sergeant was an experienced man with decades in the police force, and he knew how to recognize a suspicious situation when he saw one. He looked at Jack's form and frowned. So, Jack, what's the accusation here? Resisting authority? Is that all you've got? Jack, without looking up, replied defensively. He was in a place he clearly shouldn't have been, acting suspiciously. When I approached him, he was disrespectful and questioned my authority. That's more than enough. Henderson leaned slightly to read the form better. Disrespectful? Questioned your authority? Jack, that's not a crime. Do you have any concrete evidence that he was involved in something illegal? Any witnesses, anything in his car, anything at all? Jack finally looked up, irritated by the sergeant's questions. I know how to recognize a criminal when I see one, Mike. I don't need a list of evidence to know when someone is up to something. The sergeant let out a long sigh and shook his head. You know, Jack, there's something about Darren that's different. He doesn't seem scared. He doesn't try to justify himself or protest. It's not the typical reaction of someone guilty or even someone who knows they're being treated unfairly. He's too calm. Henderson paused and looked directly at Jack. Doesn't that bother you at all? Jack leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. He's pretending, Mike. All this calmness is just to try to seem superior, like he's better than everyone here. I've seen this kind of behavior before. Henderson raised his eyebrows, visibly skeptical. Have you really, Jack? Or are you letting your intuition deceive you? Because, so far, all I see is a man who was brought here for no clear reason and who, apparently, knows exactly what's going on. Jack stood up abruptly, throwing the pen on the table. You know what, Mike? If you have so many doubts about how I do my job, why don't you take the case? Maybe you'd enjoy spending the night arguing with criminals who think they're victims. Henderson didn't respond immediately, just watched as Jack left the reception and walked to the break room. The sergeant then looked at the other officers present, who seemed uncomfortable with the exchange between the two. Although they said nothing, it was clear that many shared Henderson's distrust. Meanwhile, in the cell, Darren was sitting calmly on the concrete bench. He knew that the events of that night were unfolding predictably, but something in his posture suggested he was in control of the situation, even being the man behind bars. Occasionally, he noticed furtive glances from other officers passing by in the hallway. Some looked on with curiosity, others with suspicion, but all seemed intrigued. Darren, noticing the buzz around him, lifted his eyes and smiled slightly. It wasn't a broad smile, but a subtle expression, as if to say without words that he knew something no one else did. The gesture, small and seemingly harmless, had a strange impact. Some officers frowned, others quickly averted their gaze, as if they had been caught in the act. The effect of Darren's smile was almost disarming. Back at the reception, Jack returned with a cup of coffee in hand, trying to regain his composure. He noticed the tense atmosphere in the room and, realizing that the other officers still seemed interested in Darren's case, made a biting comment. You guys are paying too much attention to him. This guy is just another thug who thinks he can outsmart everyone. There's nothing to see here. Hours had passed since Darren Johnson was placed in the cell. Throughout that time, he maintained his calm demeanor, observing the activity in the police station without showing any anxiety or urgency. Jack, on the other side of the room, cast disdainful glances from time to time, trying to decipher what kept him so serene. For Jack, it was unbearable. He wanted to see nervousness, regret, or even fear. But he saw none of that. Finally, Darren broke the silence. He stood up from the bench and called one of the officers passing by in the hallway. Can I make a call now? He asked in a calm but firm tone. The officer hesitated, looking in Jack's direction as if waiting for a sign of approval. Jack, who was leaning against the reception desk, raised his head, suspicious. And who are you going to call? He asked sarcastically. Your mom? Or maybe some public defender who won't even know how to help you. Darren kept his gaze fixed on Jack. That's none of your business. I have the right to make a call, don't I? Jack scoffed but gestured for the officer to open the cell. Let him call. Let's see who he can bother at this hour of the night. Darren was taken to a phone in the corner of the reception area. The other officers paused for a moment to observe the scene, curious. He dialed calmly, without hesitation, and spoke only a few words. This is Darren Johnson. I need you to take care of a situation for me. Then he hung up the phone, thanking the officer who accompanied him. Jack, on the other side of the room, crossed his arms and let out a mocking laugh. Is that it? Are you just going to wait now? I hope your contact is good because you're going to spend the night here. Darren simply returned to the cell without responding, sitting back down on the bench. Minutes later, the main phone in the police station rang. One of the officers answered, and the conversation was brief. Soon, the officer on the phone turned pale, his eyes wide. He put his hand over the receiver and called Sergeant Henderson, who was on the other side of the room. "Sergeant, it's for you. It seems serious." Henderson, intrigued, picked up the phone. "This is Sergeant Mike Henderson. Who am I speaking to?" He listened attentively for a few seconds, and his expression changed completely. His posture became rigid, almost formal, as he nodded silently. Finally, he replied, "Understood, sir. We will resolve this immediately." He hung up and stood still for a moment, processing the call. "Jack," Henderson said, in a tone firmer than usual, "we need to release Darren Johnson. Now!" Jack stood up abruptly, confused and irritated. "What? Why would we do that? He's a clear suspect. What's going on?" Henderson didn't waste time with explanations. He grabbed the keys and went straight to the cell, where he opened the door and signaled for Darren to come out. "Mr. Johnson, you are free to go. I apologize for any inconvenience." Jack watched the scene in disbelief. "Wait a minute, what are you doing? He can't just leave. I spent hours dealing with this guy." Darren exited the cell with the same serenity he had maintained all night. He adjusted his jacket, glanced briefly at Henderson, and said, "Thank you, Sergeant. I know this wasn't easy for you." As Darren walked through the reception area toward the exit, Jack stepped into his path, confused and furious. "Is someone going to explain to me what's going on here? Why is he being released? Who the hell is this guy?" Darren stopped, smiled slightly, and turned to Jack. Slowly, he took his wallet from the inner pocket of his jacket and opened it, revealing a gleaming gold badge. He held the wallet at eye level for Jack, who had to lean in to read the clearly engraved words: United States Department of Justice, Federal Prosecutor. Jack froze. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He stared at the badge, unable to process what he was seeing. Darren closed the wallet with a firm motion and stepped forward, speaking with the same calmness as always. "You wanted to teach me about authority, didn't you? Well, now you're going to learn what abuse of power means." The morning after the incident, Darren Johnson took the steps he had already planned while sitting in his cell. He went straight to the FBI office in Richmond, where he filed a formal complaint against Jack O'Connor. In the complaint, Darren detailed the racist approach, arbitrary detention, and abusive interrogation he suffered. More than that, he highlighted that Jack not only acted with prejudice, but also tried to fabricate a charge against him, showing complete disrespect for the law and civil rights. With the complaint, Darren attached compelling evidence. He had recorded Jack's initial approach with his cell phone, activating the recording as soon as he noticed the officer's hostile tone. Although the video did not capture everything, Jack's initial words and behavior were enough to corroborate Darren's story. Additionally, Darren had the support of the Department of Justice, which immediately pressured local authorities to initiate an investigation. The FBI, aware of the seriousness of the situation and Jack's already questionable reputation, acted quickly. A team of investigators was assigned to review not only Darren's case, but also Jack's history as a police officer. It didn't take long for concerning patterns to emerge. Old reports showed a series of complaints from Black and Latino citizens who alleged they had been targets of Jack's arbitrary and abusive approaches. Some of these complaints had been filed away without investigation, but now, under federal scrutiny, these cases gained new relevance. Meanwhile, at the Richmond police station, the atmosphere was tense. Jack's suspension, ordered by superiors as soon as the complaint became public, was a shock to many, but not a surprise. Sergeant Henderson, although he did not openly admit it, felt a certain relief to see that Jack's actions would finally be questioned. "We always knew he crossed the line," Henderson commented in a discreet conversation with another officer. But no one had the courage to confront him because of his connections in high places. The news of Darren's complaint and Jack's suspension quickly reached the local media. Richmond newspapers and TV stations gave significant coverage to the case, which soon began to attract national attention. Headlines like "Federal Prosecutor Denounces Police Officer for Racism in Richmond" and "Local Police Under Investigation After Abusive Approach" dominated the news. Darren, although reluctant to give interviews, made a brief statement to the press, highlighting the importance of combating institutional racism and assuring that he would seek justice not only for himself, but for all who had suffered at the hands of people like Jack. The fallout sparked a wave of mobilization in Richmond. Activist groups, such as the local NAACP chapter and community organizations, began organizing protests. Peaceful marches took to the streets of downtown, with hundreds of people carrying signs that read "Justice for Darren" and "End Racism in the Police." Community leaders called for not only Jack's punishment, but also a comprehensive review of police practices in Richmond, demanding transparency and accountability. Jack, for his part, was isolated, suspended, and without the support of the superiors who had previously protected him. He found himself at the center of a storm. Although he tried to justify his actions, his explanations fell on deaf ears. The pattern of behavior revealed by the FBI investigation became impossible to ignore, and even some of his former allies began to distance themselves. At the station, the remaining officers faced public and internal pressure. Henderson, who was now being consulted by the FBI as part of the investigation, commented during a meeting, "This case is not just about Jack. It's about what we have allowed to happen here for years. It's time for us to change." The Richmond community watched the events unfold with a mix of indignation and hope. For many, Darren Johnson's case represented not only an example of abuse of power, but also an opportunity to expose the systemic failures of the local police. Darren, for his part, knew the road would be long, but he was determined to move forward. He believed that justice was not just an individual matter, but a collective movement that required courage, action, and perseverance. The trial of Jack O'Connor attracted massive attention, not only in Richmond but across the country. The courtroom was packed with journalists, activists, and community members present to follow every detail of the proceedings. Darren Johnson, although not directly involved in the case, due to his position as a federal prosecutor, played a crucial role by providing the evidence that exposed Jack's abusive behavior. The case was conducted swiftly, but not without relentless rigor. The prosecution presented a solid line of argument based on a history of abuses that had, until then, been ignored or minimized. Citizens who had suffered unfair treatment at the hands of Jack were called to the witness stand, each detailing their experiences with the officer. Among the testimonies were accounts of public humiliations, arbitrary detentions, and verbal assaults, all with a common denominator. The victims were predominantly Black or Latino individuals. One of the witnesses, a woman named Maria Gomez, recounted how Jack had detained her 17-year-old son without apparent reason, claiming he looked like he was up to something while walking to school. Another witness, an elderly man named Robert Hill, told how Jack had brutally searched him during a traffic stop simply because he was driving a rental car in an upscale neighborhood. These accounts, combined with the recording made by Darren on the night of his arrest, painted a devastating picture of Jack's pattern of racist and authoritarian behavior. During the trial, Jack attempted to defend himself. He claimed that he had always acted in the interest of public safety and that his approach to Darren had been misinterpreted. "I was just doing my duty," he said, visibly tense. Being a police officer means making tough decisions in unpredictable situations. However, his defense was dismantled point by point by the prosecution. The recordings, the testimonies, and even accounts from fellow officers who testified against him made it clear that his actions went far beyond the call of duty. Sergeant Mike Henderson, who had remained silent for years, finally spoke openly in court. He described how Jack was known for his problematic behavior and how other officers feared retaliation for questioning him. "We failed," Henderson said gravely. "We allowed this kind of behavior to persist because it was easier to ignore than to confront. This needs to end here." The prosecution also highlighted Jack's attempt to fabricate charges against Darren, using police records that showed inconsistencies in his official report as evidence. An expert analyzed the video recorded by Darren and confirmed that there was nothing in his behavior that justified Jack's approach, let alone the arrest. It was evident that Jack had acted out of prejudice, driven by a belief that Darren should not have been in an upscale neighborhood. When the moment for sentencing arrived, the courtroom fell into absolute silence. The judge, after deliberating, was emphatic in his decision. This case is not just about an individual. It is about the responsibility of those who have the duty to protect and serve. The defendant's behavior was a betrayal of that duty, a clear abuse of power, and a violation of the fundamental rights of his citizens. This court cannot tolerate such conduct. Jack was convicted of abuse of power, misconduct, and racial discrimination. The sentence included prison time, loss of his position on the police force, and revocation of all retirement benefits he had accumulated throughout his career. Additionally, he was fined and required to participate in re-education programs, a symbolic measure to highlight the seriousness of his actions. The conviction was met with relief and celebration by the community. Activist groups that had followed the case from the beginning organized a vigil the following night, highlighting the trial as a milestone in the fight against police brutality and systemic racism in Richmond. Signs reading "Justice for Darren" and "Accountability for All" filled the streets, while speeches emphasized that the fight for equality and justice was far from over, but that important steps were being taken. Darren, who watched the verdict without showing much emotion, gave a brief statement to the press after the sentencing. "This victory is not mine. It belongs to the community. It is for all those who have been silenced, ignored, or treated as less worthy. Justice does not erase the past, but it gives us a chance to build a better future." Days after the trial concluded, Darren Johnson was invited for an interview on the highest-rated show on national television. The studio was brightly lit, and the audience eagerly awaited to hear from the man whose story had catalyzed an urgent conversation about racism and abuse of power in the United States. Sitting across from the host, Darren was impeccably dressed, but his expression reflected seriousness and humility. He knew that this moment was more than just an opportunity to tell his side of the story. It was a platform to convey a larger message. The interview began with a recap of the events that led to his arrest, the trial of Jack O'Connor, and the mobilization that followed. Darren listened attentively as the host highlighted the main points, nodding silently. When it was his turn to speak, he began firmly, but without bitterness. "I never wanted to be the center of this story," Darren said. "That night, I was just another citizen trying to live my life. What happened to me is not an exception. It is a reality that many people face every day, but that, unfortunately, often remains invisible. The fact that I am a federal prosecutor should not have been the reason my case received attention. My freedom and dignity should have been guaranteed by the simple fact that I am human." The audience remained in absolute silence as Darren continued. Structural racism is not just about large acts of discrimination. It is in the small decisions, the snap judgments, the denied opportunities. It is in the assumption that a person, because of the color of their skin, does not belong in a place, a position, or a luxury car. This needs to change, and that change starts with each of us. The host, visibly moved by Darren's words, asked what he believed was necessary to effectively combat prejudice. He answered without hesitation: education and empathy. We need to educate our communities about the history and consequences of racism. We need to teach people to put themselves in others' shoes, to question their own biases. And, above all, we need the courage to confront the system and demand accountability. After the interview, Darren returned to Richmond to participate in a community event in the same neighborhood where he had been arrested. The event, organized by local groups, aimed to promote reconciliation and dialogue between the police and the community. There were booths with food, activities for children, and a small stage where local leaders took turns speaking. Darren arrived quietly, but his presence was quickly noticed. Young people, adults, and even police officers who had participated in the movement for change came to greet him. In an emotional moment, Darren took the stage to speak to those present. He began by thanking the community for their support and emphasized that this victory was not his alone, but belonged to everyone. When we confront injustice, we are not fighting just for ourselves, but for those who came before us and for those who will come after. What happened here in Richmond is proof that when we come together, justice can prevail. After the speech, Darren stepped down from the stage and spent the rest of the event interacting with the youth. He spoke with a group of teenagers, sharing his journey and answering questions about how they could contribute to a fairer world. "Never let anyone define who you are," he told a boy who asked how to face prejudice. "Your worth does not depend on other people's opinions, but on what you know to be true about yourself." The event concluded with a large group photo, symbolizing the community's unity around a common goal. As Darren walked back to his car, he passed by the cafe where it all began. He paused for a moment, looking at the place with a subtle smile. It was not a smile of bitterness, but of renewal. That corner had been the stage for an injustice, but now it was a symbol of something greater. proof that courage, truth, and solidarity can transform even the darkest moments into an opportunity for change. Darren left Richmond that night with a heart full of hope. He knew that the fight against racism and abuse of power was long and arduous. But he also knew that every step forward, no matter how small it seemed, was a step in the right direction. He deeply believed that with determination, education, and empathy, a fairer future was possible. And, above all, he knew that even when facing the worst adversities, there is always room to build something better.
If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. These other stories will also move you. Click to continue watching.